In this video, I want to get a handle on what fascism is and to explain how and why it is a variant of socialism. Let us consider, for example, some statements from the Fascist Manifesto written by Benito Mussolini.
The crucial mistake he makes is that he quotes the Fascist Manifesto like, I don't even know if this guy knows that it wasn't written by Mussolini, it was written by other people, and it was written like a decade before Mussolini came to power. And when Mussolini came to power, he did almost none of the things that they said they were gonna do in the manifesto. Mussolini was not a big proponent of like a social democratic state or something, not at all. In fact, he was a major proponent of corporate capitalism. And we will return to that point more when we get to talking about what fascism means and if fascism is actually at all similar to socialism or not. Because in my opinion, fascism is totally the opposite of socialism, but is actually similar to capitalism. In fact, it is a form of capitalism, one of the more common forms of capitalism.
There are a number of features in common with socialism here. It is clear that fascism, like socialism, is opposed to classical liberalism. In fact, I think we should dispense with the far left, far right dichotomy here, and thus I have devised this triangle. You can see that socialism and fascism are united in their opposition against classical liberalism. Their similarities greatly outnumber their differences.
Clearly, what he's trying to do, he claims to be like an objective scholar or whatnot, that he just wants to find out the truth, but he's already, in his mind, come to the conclusion that he wants to equate socialism with fascism. So therefore, he says that we need to dispense with the left and right dichotomy, which is hilarious. That is the most crucial element in this. He wants to ignore that, because it goes against his preconceived outcome that he wants to come to. If you actually want to look at the world in terms of reality and how stuff actually works, like rich people are fine with democracy and they might even prefer the facade of democracy, but at the end of the day, they just care about being rich. They care about their property rights, and property rights in capitalism are seen as the most important thing. And what does fascism do? Fascism protects the private property of the capitalists and crushes the workers, crushes the communists, and for that reason, it was not the socialists who supported Mussolini and supported Hitler, it was the capitalists who supported Mussolini and supported Hitler.
The first and most obvious feature is that they favour state control of the economy to the free market. Entrepreneurship and individual free enterprise is banned. In the cases of both fascism and socialism, state ministries rather than the marketplace determine production and supply regardless of the demands. The government also set wages and prices. And so, in virtually all respects, fascism, just like socialism, ran a planned economy based on government calculation and bureaucracy rather than market forces. Here, Adam Smith's invisible hand was crushed under the boot of the state. Now, there are some superficial differences here. For example, under socialism, the workers own the means of production, which basically means that the government owns and runs industry. Under fascism, in the stricter sense, as I'm sure you're aware if you've ever seen Schindler's List, individual businessmen retained ownership of their factories, but all of their operations were pressed in the national interest. Consider this from Hitler. The state should retain supervision, and each property owner should consider himself appointed by the state. It is his duty not to use his property against the interests of others among his own people. This is the crucial matter. The Third Reich will always retain its right to control the owners of property. So basically, factory owners had to do whatever the government told them to do.
He says that it's a superficial difference that while the USSR collectivized its property and eliminated private property, Hitler always defended private property, and when he says that Nazi Germany didn't have a market, he's simply either ignorant or lying. They totally had a market. The Nazis didn't have a planned economy. Now, they had what they called 4-year plans, but that was just what they called them. Like, modern China has what they call plans, and India had economic plans. That doesn't make them socialist countries. He says that it's a superficial difference that the USSR eliminated private property and that Germany didn't. But in fact, that's the most crucial element of this. He ignores that, but he focuses on the superficial, what he thinks are similarities. In Germany, capitalists remained in power and made record profits. What he quotes from Hitler is Nazi propaganda, and Nazi propaganda says that there's no class differences, that everybody is on the same team, the worker and capitalist are both working for the greater German Reich or whatnot. But that is obvious nonsense. Like, of course the worker is being exploited, and of course the capitalist is getting super rich by exploiting these workers. He's just totally buying Hitler's propaganda. Basically, he says that what the Nazis had was not real capitalism because they had state regulation. Now, every state, every capitalist state has regulations. Granted, the Nazis had more regulation than, a typical capitalist country, but then again, it was a war economy, and compared to other capitalist war economies, it was no different. It was absolutely similar. In the UK and USA, during the war, the state took a more active role in dictating what the capitalists needed to produce, but they still insisted on keeping the capitalists in power, protecting their property, paying them exorbitant amounts of money to produce all those things. Hitler and Mussolini pursued totally consistently capitalist policy. They got in power and they were helped by the capitalist ruling classes of their countries, because the ruling classes of their countries thought that these fascists would be useful in crushing the communists and the socialists and the leftists. And when they got in power, what did they do? They crushed the left. Despite all their rhetoric, they lowered wages. They increased taxes on the workers. They actually privatized a number of major enterprises that used to be state-owned. What did they do then? They prepared for a war, for a massive war of conquest to conquer other European countries and colonies all over the world to allow the expansion of their own national capitalism. To get the resources, get the markets, and cheap labor, even slave labor. That's the German capitalists actually used slave labor that Hitler provided them with.
The second common feature is that both fascists and socialists strive for self-sufficiency, that is, in relying on native production rather than foreign imports for all goods.
The question needs to be asked, like, why did the Soviet Union want to be as self-sufficient as possible? Because it was the only socialist country, and all the capitalist countries were pretty damn hostile to them. So they didn't so much want to be self-sufficient, they needed to be. It was forced upon them. And why did Hitler want to be relatively self-sufficient? Well, I mean, Germany never was really self-sufficient, but because he wanted to utilize those resources for war. It's not that Hitler was opposed to market trade or something. It's just that you can't attack other countries and trade with them at the same time. It doesn't work like that. If you want to attack them, then you need to have the resources from other sources.
A third common feature is the brutal suppression of individual rights for the collective good. Consider this from Mussolini. The citizen in the fascist state is no longer a selfish individual who has the antisocial rights of rebelling against any law of the collectivity. The fascist state, with its corporative conception, puts men and their possibilities into productive work and interprets for them the duties they have to fulfill. Note the strong emphasis on collectivity and cooperation for the common good.
In my opinion, he buys into the Nazi propaganda a bit too much, because he's, when Hitler and Mussolini talk about the common good and whatnot, it's not really true. What fascists always wanted to do was preach class collaboration. They wanted to say that the worker has to work for the common good and the capitalist has to run his industries for the common good, and we're all like on the same level, we're all part of the nation, and there's no class differences and no class struggle. But that's all nonsense. Talk about common good, like what kind of common good? The workers were getting exploited, their wages were being cut, their taxes were being increased, while the capitalists were making massive profits. There was no common good in that equation, and whose rights were being limited? The capitalist rights were not being limited. They got to keep their property. They still remain rich. There's famous instances of them even going against the Nazi regime and even breaking the law, even selling stuff to the Allies during the war, and nothing much happened to them. The only significant group of capitalists who were actually punished were Jews, and that was a propaganda stunt. But most capitalists were totally fine. On the other hand, the left and all the democratic forces and the communists and the workers in Germany were totally obliterated and crushed. But if you look at the USSR, on the other hand, the USSR never talked about the common good between the worker and the capitalist. It was the total opposite rhetoric. They said that they will strip the exploiter peasants of their status, eliminate the NEP capitalists, they will take away their status and they will become just ordinary workers. And in the Soviet Union also, you need to look at whose rights were being limited. The capitalists' political rights were being limited. The workers were able to run in elections and were able to vote in elections and were able to join parties, join trade unions, join co-ops, whatnot. But capitalists, on the other hand, were not allowed to do those things. Nazi Germany oppressed predominantly the workers and ethnic minorities, whereas the USSR suppressed capitalists, rich people, fascists, and right-wingers, and all kinds of reactionaries and exploiters. So once again, he's ignoring the most important part and focusing on something totally irrelevant. He's focusing on the obvious fact that states limit the rights of individuals. Of course they do. That's what states do. A state is an instrument of class struggle and class power. The ruling class, who controls the state, will use the state to keep themselves in power. It's just that in the case of the fascist countries, the ruling class were capitalists, and in the case of the Soviet Union, the ruling class were workers and not capitalists.
There is the emphasis on strong military and secret police.
Well, yeah, Germany was a aggressive imperialist country. The Soviet Union emphasized the military. Well, their argument for building up the military was that they were going to be attacked by all the capitalist countries, and they were. Like, in the Civil War they were attacked, in the 20s they were attacked, in the 30s they were attacked.
General Graves, with members of his staff, and John Caldwell, the U.S. consul in Vladivostok, visited Admiral Rogers to discuss our Siberian operation.
Is in Mongolia to commemorate the 70th anniversary of one of the forgotten battles which shaped World War II. The Battle of Khalkhin-Gol took place on the Mongolian border in 1939, just weeks before Hitler's troops marched into Poland. The Soviet Union and Mongolia defeated Japanese forces, preventing Japan from linking up with Nazi troops.
And most famously, they were attacked by Hitler. And it's funny, he talks about the military, but what country has the most massive military budget in the world? The United States. Capitalist United States. Talking about the secret police, like, really what he should be talking about is intelligence service or internal affairs or whatnot. The Nazis did call their thing the Geheime Staatspolizei or the Gestapo, the secret state police, but the name doesn't really mean anything. Yeah, it's basically the same thing as the CIA, NSA, MI6, MI5. It's, the basic same thing. It's just that because it's the Soviets, they're like, ooh, secret police, like NKVD, like, they're not called internal affairs. They're called secret police and stuff like that. Like, it's nonsensical cherry picking. Every country has a secret police, if you want to call it that. Once again, we can play this naming game. The Finnish intelligence used to be called state police. It wasn't called secret state police, but it was called state police. And after that, they renamed it from the state police to protection police. Still the same exact thing. It's the equivalent of the CIA.
Now, the military aspect is interesting because so often in history, dictatorships have come about through coups d'etats and military juntas. We should not confuse military dictatorship with either fascism or socialism, even though the two often go side by side.
To me, it's very interesting what he says here, because he doesn't explain how Hitler came to power, but he implies that Hitler and Mussolini didn't come to power in coups d'etats. Which is weird, because they totally did come to power in coups d'etats. Mussolini had his buddies in the government and in the state machine. His march on Rome was almost a formality. Like, it was a symbolic thing. It was already pre-arranged that he was gonna be granted power by the capitalists. Capitalists, they thought that democracy is dangerous. We need to get rid of democracy. We need a strong man to crush the left and protect our interests. It was the same in Nazi Germany. Hitler had a failed putsch in the 20s. He was imprisoned for a short time, and then he was let go. If he was a leftist, he would have been executed, but because he was a right-winger and the capitalists thought he would be useful, they let him go. And then, when he was already inside the government, they arranged the Reichstag burning, and then carried out a classic coup, and turned the parliamentary democratic state into a fascist dictatorship. And this brings us to the question of the military junta. He says that military junta is different from fascism and different from socialism. It's not so different from fascism. If you look at fascist Japan, sometimes called militarist Japan, Pinochet is often called a fascist, but he's also a classic military dictator. They're far-right capitalist dictatorships. What exactly is the major difference between Hitler's economic policy, Mussolini's economic policy, and Pinochet's economic policy? There's not much difference. It's mainly a difference in rhetoric. Hitler used more quasi-leftist sounding rhetoric, which was only empty rhetoric. Mussolini used more like centrist nationalist rhetoric, more pro-capitalist rhetoric, and Pinochet used more pro-free market rhetoric, but even that was largely just rhetoric, because they were all mixed economies. None of them had absolute free market with no regulation. They were all capitalist mixed economies. Hitler, Mussolini, and Pinochet, they privatized a number of industries because they wanted to make more profits for their capitalist buddies, but they also nationalized some industries. Now, why would they do that? Because you need that for the war and for the country to run and function.
Take someone like Saddam Hussein, who hero-worshipped Joseph Stalin and led the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party.
Saddam was a CIA man, put in power by the CIA, by the United States, and he killed all the communists.
They are both utopian visions. And as we have seen, specifically utopian visions developed to fix the perceived inequalities and problems created by laissez-faire classical liberalism.
He's advocating laissez-faire capitalism, but laissez-faire capitalism is one of the most utopian things I've ever heard. Infinite growth in a finite planet, constant, ever-increasing growth. Competition is itself totally utopian and self-contradictory, because he wants a free market. That means no monopoly and no state intervention. Well, if the state doesn't intervene, there's gonna be monopolies. So you already need a state to eliminate monopolies to some degree. And then, even if you have a state, it's impossible to not have monopolies. Monopolization and centralization of property is a natural and inevitable outcome of capitalism and capitalist competition itself. Competition creates monopoly. What is the point of competition? Well, to defeat your opponents in competition and gain a bigger market share. That's what you try to do. After you have that for a while, you start having these massive multinational corporations who, even though they're not technically monopolies, as in there are other companies who compete with them, they are just so massive that they control the vast majority of the market. Capitalism is extremely utopian. Marxism is based on a materialistic, scientific worldview, whereas capitalism is built on an idealist worldview which is impossible. Nazism, granted, is the height of utopia. It is the notion of class collaboration within capitalism, capitalism without greed and stuff like that. You know, Marxism is really the only one of these that is not utopian, but they're all ideologically based. They all have an ideological framework and an ideological goal and whatnot. It's weird that he singles out these two ideologies and says that, oh, they're ideological, therefore they're similar. Like, nah.
Now, what don't they have in common? Socialism is international, and fascism is ethno-nationalistic. Socialism seeks expansion through revolution, fascism through imperial conquest.
Fascism says that some people are superior to others. Socialism says that everybody is equal, or should be equal. Fascism is aggressive imperialist. Socialism is not. Fascism is racist. Socialism is internationalist. Fascism is conservative. Socialism is not. Fascism is class collaborationist. Socialism talks about class struggle. Fascism is a form of capitalism. Socialism is the opposite of capitalism. Fascism protects private property. Socialism seeks the abolition of private property. Honestly, there's almost no similarities. Let's be honest, the only similarity is a superficial one. The way he paints them is that they're both authoritarian. That is somewhat relative. We should accept that revolutionary regimes tend to be authoritarian to a degree, especially one that is constantly under attack, like the Soviet Union. But that doesn't really explain anything. Why did these governments use the methods they used? Well, the Soviets felt very threatened by external enemies and internal enemies, so they banned the parties that supported the monarchy and capitalism and whatnot. And the Nazis thought that they needed to crack down on leftism to secure their power. But this is not a crucial similarity. The United States also cracked down hard on communists during the McCarthy era because they thought that there was a serious threat from the communists.
If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist.
His argument is built around this naive idea that capitalism is never authoritarian, when in fact capitalism tends to be authoritarian most of the time. In fact, fascism is simply the most extreme authoritarian version of capitalism. Capitalist countries have always used authoritarian methods to crush the working class whenever they have felt that it was necessary. You can look at the Freikorps in Weimar, Germany, or, like, Hitler's street gangs and Mussolini's street gangs are prime examples of capitalists using these kinds of things to crack down on dissent and on leftism. Look at how the CIA assassinated all the civil rights leaders in the US and how they terrorized the peace movement and all that.
Remember that the aim of total self-sufficiency is a common goal to both fascism and socialism. And Hitler wanted resources, for example, because he believed he was leading a superior race. He thought nothing of steamrolling into other countries to take their land and goodies.
As if the military conquest thing was like something specific to fascism. It's just something that capitalism does. It's a perfectly normal trait of imperialist capitalism, and imperialism is what all capitalist countries do when they are powerful enough. You don't see small, weak countries doing it as much. Belgium doesn't do it anymore, Sweden doesn't do it anymore. You think they just got better and they don't want to do that anymore? No, it's just they don't have the military muscle to do that anymore, or the economic muscle. Aggressive military action like that and imperialism is just something capitalism does. It's not specific to fascism, because capitalism needs constant and ever-increasing growth, so it is a competition for resources, cheap labor, and possibly more than anything, the source for new markets. It's not an accident that all capitalist countries that are capable of imperialism practice it. It is a inevitable outcome of capitalism. Why do you think that the United States has intervened and invaded and couped and attacked like more than 100 countries since the end of the Second World War? and pretty much as many before that. Do you think it's just some specific, every instance of those was just like some random coincidence? No, it's just what capitalism does. Like, you need to go out there and conquer resources and sources of cheap labor and take over markets, and you need to do that because you got excess capital. Like, if you're a country that has excess capital, you need to start exporting that capital. And that means investing abroad, investing into third world countries and colonies and whatnot. And if those countries have their industries nationalized, and if they have regulations and minimum wages and things like that, then it's not as profitable. So you gotta go in there and you gotta kill their president in a coup or in an invasion. Like, that's why the USA went after Saddam, even though they were the ones who put him in power. Like, Saddam was wanting more money and wanting a bigger share of the oil quota and stuff like that. He was cutting into their profits, so they were like, alright, that's it, we gotta go in there and we gotta stop that. Gotta deregulate, gotta privatize everything, and whatnot. If he thinks he can have capitalism where imperialism doesn't occur, he's the one who is a utopian. So in regards to your last point, socialism and fascism are totally different. They're basically each other's opposites. There's a reason why they've always been mortal enemies. Fascism is a form of capitalism, one of the more common ones. To me, as a Marxist, the main difference is, does the country have a capitalist private economy? Does it have private property, markets, whatnot? Or does it have collective ownership of the means of production, no private property, planned economy, and stuff like that? So is it a socialist country or a capitalist country? Of course, there's a spectrum of economic policy. That is, there's countries that are more mixed economy than super free market capitalism. There's state capitalism, and there's also market socialism. Personally, I hate market socialism, but the key difference is it a capitalist country, is it a socialist country?
In the parks after dark by candlelight, getting spied on by